If you were looking for just one single word to describe the entire Russian economy, the best word that you could probably come up with would be diseased. In fact, the entire Russian economy is diseased right now, and it is actually afflicted with a very specific disease known as Dutch disease. Nothing against the Dutch, that's just where the term comes from. Don't shoot the messenger. But when you look at the Russian economy right now, they are actually afflicted with this very specific economic disease, not just at one level, but on multiple different levels that gets worse the deeper you look. They are afflicted with Dutch disease at a national macro level, but they are also afflicted with Dutch disease as you get down lower and you look into the specific communities, the specific local economies within Russia. And in fact, you might be able to say that Russia actually has double Dutch disease. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about when I use the term Dutch disease, don't worry, I'll explain everything fully in just a minute. But first, like any good doctor, before jumping straight into the prognosis, we should first start by looking at the symptoms that Russia is displaying on the surface right now. And then we can go back and tie those symptoms into a more severe underlying condition so we can see what is actually going on in the Russian economy and where things are ultimately leading, especially if they don't get treatments or if they don't respond correctly to the treatments that they get. And right now it's starting to look like they might not even get the treatments in the first place. So right now when it comes to Russia's economy, everybody knows that it's showing some severe symptoms. But this is especially true when it comes to oil and gasoline. In Russia right now, there are massive gasoline shortages, and gas stations around the country are simply running out of gasoline. And many of them are closing up shop, often permanently, because they're basically just throwing in the towel, saying that this just isn't worth the effort. When you can get gasoline in Russia, especially in regions between major cities or out in the Far East and in Siberia, you generally have to wait in a very long queue to get a very small ration of gasoline. And even this is not sufficient and is quickly running out. And this is a direct result of Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, in particular Russian oil refineries, which are not letting up, they are only increasing with each passing day. Russia is getting so desperate because of this that they are now turning to other countries for large-scale gasoline imports, which is something that Russia hasn't done since the 90s, and it is literally about as desperate as you can get, especially when you consider that Russia is now trying to import more and more gasoline from China, a country that will certainly exploit this crisis that Russia is in because they have exploited every other crisis that Russia has been in since the start of Russia's war against Ukraine. Typically, of course, Russia is an energy exporter, and they're a massive one. They export primarily crude oil, but they also export some refined products as well. And Russia's energy exports make up the majority of income within the entire country. Even those incomes that don't come directly from energy exports often come indirectly from energy exports, basically supporting the energy industry in one way or another, or receiving their incomes from energy industry incomes. So, for example, if an employee gets their income from the oil and natural gas industry, that employee will then buy a home with that money, and that employee might also go to restaurants with that money or buy a vehicle or clothing. But ultimately, a lot of that income, most of Russia's income, comes from their energy exports. But now Russia is finding itself in a place where not only can they not sufficiently export enough energy to make the income they need because of sanctions, but they are also having to buy back refined energy from the people they are exporting to, the same people that have been exploiting them in their crisis where they don't have enough buyers due to sanctions. China, for example, has exploited Russia to get very low energy prices so low that Russia is often barely making a profit, if they're making a profit at all. And now Russia is having to buy back energy from China, this same country that has purchased their energy at rock bottom prices, at what is almost certain to be highly inflated rates because Russia is just so desperate for refined product. And that means that Russia not only has far lower income, they now have far higher expenses related to energy, and that is going to have a catalyzing impact throughout their entire economy, and it will be more catastrophic the deeper that it gets. China's inevitable price gouging, though, isn't going to be Russia's only problem when it comes to higher energy prices, not by a long shot. Also, just intrinsically, Russian energy prices are about to get higher just because of the nature of logistics. If you look at a map of the Russian oil refineries that Ukraine has been striking, the key characteristic that you'll notice is that they're all over the country. They're not just centered in one area. And there's a really good reason for this. The reason that refineries are geographically distributed all across the country is to lower last mile transport costs, so that refined energy doesn't have to travel as far, because to have a network that delivers refined energy from a single port to the entire country is very, very difficult to do if you even have enough trucks to do it. But it's also going to be cost prohibitive even if you can do it. So even as Russia is buying energy from China at what is certain to be an inflated rate, they're also going to have to incur additional costs that consumers are ultimately going to see at the pump, because the cost of transporting and delivering that energy is going to be so much higher. And again, that's if Russia can even do that in a timely fashion in the first place, which they might not be able to. Even if they can purchase enough energy from China for all of their needs, getting that energy where it needs to go across the country is a different story entirely. As we look at all of this, we realize that the Russian economy is entering into a very delicate situation with a very, very bad prognosis just based on the surface level symptoms. And again, we'll get more into the underlying condition. Russia already had very poor revenues because they had decreased energy trade due to sanctions because of their war against Ukraine. Now, on top of those poor revenues, Russia is having supply constraints at home, forcing imports, causing an increase in costs. But even with that increase in costs, they still cannot get back to the level where they were before. And if this is not addressed sufficiently, which it almost certainly will not be totally addressed, even if it is addressed to some degree, the Russian economy could literally seize up, both because of the lost revenues and the increased costs, but also for the simple fact that if people can't use energy, they can't buy, sell, or trade with each other. And the Russian economy that has been on life support can now find itself not able to move the lifeblood through the system. And once that blood stops pumping, the economy can actually die. I know it's a dramatic example, but with that in mind, let's talk about the underlying condition that Russia has, which is now showing itself in a very major outbreak that they might not be able to recover from. And again, the underlying condition is Dutch disease. If you're not familiar with the term Dutch disease, it's actually a fascinating example of how something that at first seems to be a blessing can turn out to be a curse if you're not careful and if you don't understand what's going on. And Dutch disease really refers to this period back in the mid-1900s where the Dutch discovered some major gas fields, natural gas fields, that allowed them to make a lot of money very, very quickly, which was a big blessing to the economy, at least to certain sectors of the economy. But the problem was, because it was so easy for the Dutch to make money extracting natural gas, that it caused basically every other sector that had traditionally been major contributors to the Dutch economy to suffer, and many of these other sectors went out of business or became very unprofitable. The reason the disease spreads in this way applies very much to Russia right now at this very moment. And it is essentially because as you have one sector of the economy that is extremely successful, the economy as a whole actually becomes more vulnerable as the other productive sectors drop out. Now, vulnerability is not equivalent to fatality. This is a disease that can either be treated or that can become worse, and the prognosis can get worse. In the case of the Netherlands, they have effectively treated their disease over many decades, and their economy is thriving. In the case of modern Russia, they are leaning into their disease and making their prognosis worse, because the Netherlands is a democratic country, while Russia is an oligarchy. And in a democratic country, the Netherlands had incentives to fix the problem, while in an oligarchy, a dictatorship, the people at the top had incentives to not care about the rest of the economy, but rather to lean into what made them personally more profitable, which has now brought their economy to this point of structural weakness. The reason the disease spreads is because when you have one really productive sector of the economy, it makes it hard for everybody else to compete. If you're making a lot of money, for example, in the gas industry in Netherlands, the problem this creates in the economy is that it boosts wages for everybody else, and that might not seem like a problem. But what happens is if you go to the gas industry and you earn an abnormally high salary there, you then have more money to spend on other services. So for example, you can spend more money on a home. You might be able to spend more money on going out to eat at restaurants more often. And this boosts wages in the services sector of the economy to the demise of the productive sectors of the economy that make their money by exporting goods to other countries. Eventually, these productive sectors cannot compete on wages in order to get employees. If somebody's going to make the same wage at a restaurant or a higher wage at a restaurant, the manufacturers also have to increase their wages, and eventually it becomes unprofitable for them. And a lot of these companies go out of business. With these companies out of business, if you then remove the remaining productive sector, the energy industry, the economy as a whole has nothing left holding it up. At first, it might seem fine because as long as the productive sector remains there, things are fine. But when something happens, like what is happening to Russia today as a result of their war in Ukraine, the underlying disease can then flare up. Russia, as I said, due to oligarchy, has had Dutch disease for a very long time. Actually, basically as long as they have existed as a nation. And in fact, you can even track their Dutch disease back to the time of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sort of had Dutch disease, and that's a large part of why the Soviet economy collapsed. It looked really strong at some periods when energy prices were high, but then when global energy prices crashed, the Soviet Union crashed with it. But when Russia restructured after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they restructured as an oligarchy, and people didn't really care about how the country as a whole did. The oligarchs cared about how much profit they could personally make, so instead of recovering from their Dutch disease, they recreated it. And because Russia has had Dutch disease for such a long time, the Russian economy has become so highly centralized around energy revenues, again, as I mentioned earlier. In the Russian economy, there is very little innovation. There is very little manufacturing. Ask yourself, when was the last time you personally purchased a good made in Russia? There might be some manufacturing. It might sell to Russia itself or some countries surrounding Russia. But typically, there are not innovative Russian brands that are selling products to the rest of the world. This applies to other sectors of the Russian economy, and it basically means that when you remove the energy sector, as has now happened, the Russian economy as a whole can quickly crumble like a house of cards. However, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Russia's Dutch disease is especially bad because it is multi-layered, multifaceted. They have double Dutch disease, or maybe a better analogy, a better children's toy, would be to say that Russia has a Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease. And each layer you open up, you see another miniature layer of Dutch disease inside. And that means that while the macro Russian economy as a whole is suffering, also individual economies within Russia, local economies, are going to suffer as well, for different reasons as well as for the overarching reason. What's even worse for Russia is that when you look at all of these layers of Dutch disease, you can actually tie all of these underlying layers back to the war in Ukraine. And again, the war in Ukraine becomes the source for all of Russia's problems, which is really sad for the country because the war in Ukraine was completely unnecessary. For example, the next major contributor to internal Dutch disease is the Russian arms industry, which is artificially creating the same effects that, for example, the gas industry created in the Netherlands from their legitimate Dutch disease. The Russian arms industry, as a result of the war in Ukraine, has been getting a lot of government funding, and they've been getting so much government funding that it has actually created massive wage hikes in Russia, and it has created a massive labor shortage. Basically, because the arms industry pays so well, Russians don't really want to work for anybody else because there's no money to be made. This has caused the arms industry to artificially inflate wages across the country, and it's caused a lot of other employers, particularly small businesses around areas where this arms industry exists, to go out of business because even though there's a lot of income in the area, they often cannot afford enough employees to continue running their businesses. The Russian arms industry, obviously, as a result of the war in Ukraine, has been getting a lot of funding, but this funding has been artificial. It has come from accounts that the government saved up for many years leading up to the war. It is coming from inflation that is helping the government to directly give the arms industry more money. And it is also coming from the Russian government basically forcing Russian banks to lend money to the arms industry, giving loans that they know full well will never be paid back because all these arms companies are just going to close up when the war ends. Because they have access to so much cash, the arms industry up to this point has been able to pay essentially unlimited salaries. They could keep increasing the salary as much as they had to increase it to get whatever employees they had to get. And funny enough, that's no longer true, but we'll come back to that. Because they've been able to raise salaries so high, it's done what Dutch disease does. It has robbed employees from every other sector, especially within local economies where there are arms factories. And it is putting all the other traditional employers out of business, or it is reducing profits for small businesses because they have to pay much higher wages to keep up. Now, up until this point, things have seemed okay because the arms industry has been getting so much money, and who doesn't like a pay rise? And these employees can then spend money throughout their local economies as well. But again, this is artificial, and eventually it will end. It will obviously end when the war ends and these companies go out of business, and these local economies will be completely robbed of all of this income, but all of the traditional employers will already be out of business, and that will be absolutely devastating. But this can also come to an end before the war in a slower phase, and that's what is happening now. Right now, when you look at arms industry job postings throughout Russia, the last I looked, there were something like 400,000 openings, which is a massive labor shortage. But despite this labor shortage, the salaries that are being advertised on these postings have actually decreased by a rather significant amount year over year. And typically when you have a labor shortage and you're trying to attract more employees to the industry, you keep bumping wages up. And so for the arms industry, with this huge labor shortage to be decreasing wages, it shows that all these sources of funds that they had, the artificial sources, are now running dry and they can't keep up. So as the defense industry runs lower and lower on funds, the defense industry will, of course, suffer. But so will the communities who built themselves around the defense industry over the last several years of war, who I can almost promise you were not planning for the day that these funds would ultimately be taken away, because they probably didn't have good economists or good leadership guiding them in that direction. The leadership all had the incentives from the top down to build the communities towards this defense industry to win the immediate war. Who cares about the consequences? And so when the consequences come, these communities will be completely unprepared. That's the second level of the Russian nesting doll of Dutch disease. Now, when we look at the third level, we see something similar but different. And this is something that is more pervasive across the rest of the Russian society. The third level of the nesting doll has to do with communities that have increasingly been building themselves around the direct military salaries, and in particular, the death benefits that are being paid out to Russian soldiers. And this is happening to a lot of small towns throughout Russia where there traditionally weren't very many high-paying jobs, and that attracted a lot of the young men to go out and join the Russian military with promises of large paychecks. Since then, a lot of these people have perished, and the war has been going on long enough that a lot of their families have finally received the death benefits, which in many cases could be hundreds or even thousands of times the wages that these people could have earned in a year, and certainly would be more than people in these communities could have expected to earn across an entire lifetime. It's essentially the same effect that you see when somebody wins the lottery. When somebody gets a large windfall of money that they didn't actually earn or work for or accumulate over a long period of time, they don't know how to manage that kind of money because they've never had it. And so you see a lot of people who are getting these windfalls, there's articles about this, just spending money like crazy. They'll go out and they'll buy very expensive fur coats. They'll go out to eat every night and things like that. And that is causing the same effect where there is a large demand on the services economies and people don't want to work in the productive capacities anymore. In a small town, that typically means people don't want to work in agriculture anymore. Why would you go and invest your capital farming a field when you could make more serving tables within your local town? And that is causing devastating effects on these local economies where they don't know how to produce anymore if they don't receive money directly from the government. Again, in the short term, it's fine as long as these funds continue, but like those who win the lottery usually lose all their money, people who are getting their money in this way are running out of their cash eventually, and eventually the source of the funds will completely dry up, and that's going to be very bad news. It's going to be bad news not just for those local economies, but especially because a lot of these jobs that are being eliminated are agriculture jobs. It's going to be bad for Russia as a whole. It's going to tend to create potentially more food shortages. Overall, then, having diagnosed all these different instances of Dutch disease across the Russian economy, the prognosis for Russia is not very good. And in fact, Russia's Dutch disease may no longer be survivable. In the very best case, what Russia needs is a transplant of leadership. And even that transplant might not be successful because the body itself is now so completely diseased. When we look at all these cases of Dutch disease, we realize that the source of funds that has made the Dutch disease survivable in each individual instance is now drying up. Of course, at the macro level, the source of funds coming from oil and gas revenues is drying up, and it's now indeed turning into an expense instead. And that ultimately is also the source of funds for the other two areas of Dutch disease, because it is the oil and gas economy that allows the funding of the military spending. The military spending is getting more and more restricted because Russia as a whole just does not have as much money. And that is going to cause the communities that have built themselves around, for example, weapons factories to kind of crumble because of that very soon. Also because people are taking their giant paychecks and destroying the economies of local communities. But because those funds are running out, even if they're not running out soon, they are eventually running out. The fate of those communities is unfortunately inevitable, especially if nothing changes. What we learn from this is, of course, a lot of different things. The first is that starting a war is a terrible idea, especially if you don't win. There will be major consequences. And Russia really needs to end their war as soon as possible, even if they don't care about Ukraine, just for their own sake and for their own futures. The second lesson we learn is a little more interesting. When you look at why is Russia suffering so badly from the Dutch disease, while other countries like the Netherlands were ultimately able to recover from it. And it comes back to that old classic tale that we've all had to learn 100 times, which is that command economies don't work. When you try to control an entire economy from the top down, whether that is directly or a little more indirectly, like the mechanisms that Putin is using to fund the war in Ukraine and trickling Dutch disease throughout the entire economy, it doesn't matter. Command economies don't work. Democracies ultimately work better because only in democracies do the countries actually have incentives to care about everybody within the country, not just the few people who accumulate the wealth and own the industries at the top. I've talked about that more in depth in another video where Russia's underlying governing structure is causing structural problems that is causing them to lose the war in Ukraine. This is another example of that. If you want to learn more, be sure to also check out that other video or a number of the other videos on this channel I cover so much. Now, if you do appreciate that coverage that I do on this channel, please do support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Those things are both completely free, but they help me out a lot. And if you really enjoy this channel and you want to support my work even more, there are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of my supporters. You guys really do make this work possible and help me to consistently create more videos for more people to hopefully make a bigger impact. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you on the next one.